the solitary confinement cells at Alcatraz, which is a pretty creepy place all on its own. But those cells are like the heart of darkness. There are 4 or 5 of them just off the library. All the cell doors open onto a windowless hallway, so it's dark leading to dark. I went in there on my own, and I swear something evil was squatting in the corner waiting for me. Leave my soul unattended. 10/10ths for creepy. Will not go back. More or less a combination of creepy and sad, but Cambodia. Went with family to see Angkor Wat. Huge temple, an absolute marvel, was featured in Tomb Raider I believe, and stopped in the town center for a bite, to eat with our guide. We wandered away from the guide just to explore a bit, and we were approached by a young girl, 15 to 16, carrying what looked to be a sleeping toddler. She asked us to buy milk for her baby and we obliged because hey, babies need food. Just as we were about to walk into the store, our guide spots us and tells us to get in his car. We used it for transportation to and from a bunch of temples. The girl then starts screaming profanities at us and the guide, and we pile into our car. She started banging on the windows of the car while still screaming after the door was closed, and surprisingly enough the toddler still didn't wake up. We asked our guide WTF just happened, and he relayed this to us. Apparently in Cambodia and some other countries, gangs will profit off of not only sex trafficking from children, but also a form of pity trafficking. They will take a small child, toddler, and drug them so they look as though they are sleeping. They'll pass the child off to a young girl who will beg for food/money/etc and pose as the toddler's mother. Then, she'll pass the child off to a new girl who will repeat the act. They do this until the child wakes up, will feed them, and then start the process again. As the toddlers get older they'll be taught to try and sell things to tourists. If they fail to meet a quota they'll sometimes lose limbs, fingers, hands, arms, legs, and will then run a story about how they stepped on an old landmine. This is actually somewhat possible as the country is still reeling from the impact Pol Pot had, and there are still unearthed landmines. But the issue is that 1% are close to the main city/Angkor Wat, which is where a majority of these children were. We were shocked to say the least. This seemed kind of far-fetched, but what else would we believe? We did some research online and found stuff about the sex trafficking, but not much about the toddler swapping and child mutilation. When we went into town the next day with our guide, what did we see? The same toddler being passed to a different girl, still knocked out, still in the same clothing. Definitely creepy. I loved Angkor Wat and thought it was beautiful, but I don't plan on going back there anytime soon. I was on a family vacation to Atlanta, about 1972. We went to visit some cousins of my grandmother's. Twin sisters, never married, in their 80s. The house was in a rundown neighborhood. From the street you'd think it was abandoned. Overgrown yard, part of the roof caved in, boarded up windows. Inside, it was all antiques and furniture from the 30s and 40s, slowly deteriorating, and it looked as though they hadn't dusted in years. Wallpaper peeling, old portraits half fallen. Looking up to the second floor from the stairs, just cobwebs and collapsed ceilings. They said they hadn't been up there in years. And definitely rat noises. They both looked and lived like ghosts, and seemed half mad, very civil and proper but off. As an 8-year-old, I was terrified, especially when one of them joked and said you should leave him here. He can live with us. I burst into tears, and we left. I went to a rest stop at 1 AM outside Springfield, Illinois a few years back. Went to the restroom and there was blood everywhere. It looked like something got slaughtered. I have never hightailed it out of somewhere so quickly beforehand. The crypt, I think that's what it was, of a church in Bayeux, France. I was there on a school trip and we could choose whether to go to this historically old church or see the Bayeux tapestry. I chose the church. They had just found the crypt a couple of years before. So I was down there by myself, taking pictures, and after a couple of minutes I started feeling downright nauseous. Like, I'm going to get sick right here nauseous. Went upstairs to get some air, and the feeling went away instantly. Creeped me out, and when I went down with the group afterwards I felt totally fine. When I was a kid, we lived in my dad's old house, from when he was a kid. It was one of the oldest houses in town, and had been there since the 1800s, but had been redone a few times. The house had 3 bedrooms, a master that used to be a screened-in porch, a regular room, and a room off to the side that was barely big enough for a twin bed. When my dad was about 11, his older brother died of heart failure, and they had his coffin put in that room for the viewing. When my grandfather died about 10 years later, his was put there too. When I was born, my grandmother offered the house to my parents, as she'd gotten remarried, so they took it for $30 a month. That room always creeped me out for some reason growing up, and I didn't like going in there. When I was older and renting the house from my grandma myself, that's when my dad told me about the viewings. Still was a creepy room, and I kept only things I didn't use on a regular basis in there. One year I worked in a haunted house that was inside a building that used to be a funeral home. The morgue was downstairs and still had the drawers. My job was to lay in the drawer and pop out when people walked by. Laying in a cramped drawer, in the dark, on cold metal, with flashes of lights and screams in the distance, was probably the creepiest place. I scared so many people, including a middle school age kid who straight up pooped his pants and a drunk college chick who peed. So it was kind of worth it. I was in a youth hostel in the Netherlands. The bathroom windows were curtained, not by cloth or blinds, but from being caked in spider webs and thousands of spiders. More spiders than I have ever seen in my life. The windows barely let in any light at all, and the spiders were fed by the insane amount of mosquitoes. Biggest spiders I have ever seen as well, other than tarantulas at the zoo. Spiders in the NL are not supposed to be that big. I never knew bugs could be obese before. Additional info, this happened a long time ago, when smartphones were just coming on the market. I was there on a 2-night school trip with like 60 other kids. I don't recall the exact location, but we were there to see a Dutch West India Company ship, so I think we were near Amsterdam, but in a smaller town. The hostel was by a pond. Additional creepiness to those saying the spiders at least helped with the mosquitoes. They didn't. The spiders stayed glued to the windows. In the morning, no one wanted to be the first to shower because the shower stalls were coated in mosquitoes. The showers were okay after 1 or 2 people had gone, because most of them got splashed off. We were allowed to swim in the nearby pond, but had to use the little dock, because if you walked in from the shore your feet would be cut up by broken glass from former tenants' discarded beer bottles. The lawn was dotted with duck and goose poop, and one girl sat in it by accident during an outdoor activity and got a massive shit stain on her pink jeans. The more I recall, the more I shudder. I had a bad case of hay fever and my eyes went so red on one day. I did get an infected bug bite on that trip which caused some serious health problems. And I got home on a Sunday, so no doctors were open. All businesses in NL typically close on Sundays, and so my mom had to run down the street to ask a neighbor who happened to be a doctor for help. He did not appreciate it. Luckily, there aren't really any venomous insects in Holland. Honesty, with how many health code violation that place must have had, I imagine it must be closed by now. Or maybe someone did the right thing and burned it down. They probably would have gotten an insurance payout, because as I can tell most of you understand, burning that place down is a thing that needed to be done. Operating room for brain surgery. It's freezing cold. They wheel you up to the stainless steel bed with a cage you put your head in. They tighten down clamps on your head, so it can't move. Then knock you out. You wake up multiple times over a 4.5-hour surgery, semi-conscious, eyes closed, but you can say "I hear you guys," or snap your fingers and hold a finger up like waiter, and the anesthesiologist hits you with a dose. After they're done, they poke a giant needle, ice pick, into different facial muscles to make sure they didn't break anything. Poking it into a muscle causes a subconscious flinching, and they look at the muscle group flinching to make sure each category is still rigged up. I had a bunch of scabs and taped cotton balls across my face and scalp. Then they seal up your skull and sign off on it. They use reciprocating saws and similar power tools to carpenters. It's morbid, terrifying, cold, but it can give you your life back. I spent 2 nights in the hospital and was driving to work 7 days later feeling like $1 million. I found an old abandoned farmhouse a little ways outside of my little town. It looked as if the people who had lived there just up and left one day. There were still dishes in the sink and a coffee cup with a newspaper beside it on the kitchen table. The date was in 2011. All their clothes were still hanging in the closet. State fair ribbons were stuck all over one wall, one dating back to 1912. Had it not been for the thick layer of dust covering everything, animal droppings, and their little footprint in the dust, you'd think someone still lived there, but no. To make it creepier, I explored the house at about 3 AM. The silence of that place felt so heavy, and it made me very uncomfortable being there. I later asked around about the house, and apparently it belonged to an old couple whose children put them in a nursing home and just abandoned the house.